Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that for the first episode dedicated to a trip, a journey away from Jerusalem, my guest is Dotan Halevy. Dotan holds a PhD from Colombia and is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem. Dotan is one of a few experts on late Ottoman and interwar Gaza. So today, for our first trip outside Jerusalem, we're gonna essentially drive south west, I guess. I'm not always very good with the cardinal directions,
yes,
but not that far away from Jerusalem anyway. And so, Dotan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Alberto. Thank you for the invitation. Indeed, southwest and the southern and the most west you can get from Jerusalem, you reach Gaza, the really last station before you leave Palestine.
So finally, I got it right. Yeah. So today I have to give away my first question about Jerusalem. But instead of that, Dotan, I want to ask you, how did you get to work on Gaza in the first place?
Yeah, this is a question that I also ask myself many times in order to kind of recall what was my initial question, because since then, I guess it started like around a decade ago. I've been drawn into so many topics that came out from the research on Gaza. So my initial interests, I believe, started from dealing with World War I in the Middle East writ large, but in Palestine particularly, by trying to uncover a specific event which was the evacuation of Jaffa in around March 1917. And that was a story that was well known within Zionist history because most of its victims of this Ottoman act of evacuation were Jews. It was the Jewish population of Jaffa and Tel Aviv. But while kind of digging into the documents of this event, I discovered that actually a quite larger event took place roughly at the same time, a few weeks before, which was the evacuation of the entire population of the city of Gaza. At the time, something between 35,000 to 40,000 people at the city. I was very surprised to find that this event was unstudied and that most historical sources could not tell where these people went, where these people go, where they found shelter for the time of the until the end of the war. So I started with kind of trying to follow their footsteps through archival paper trail, and I think and this event draw me to look further into Gaza's history before World War I and then after, and this is what I based my doctoral research on, and we can talk further about this. But I think it started there. That was the initial spark.
Just to mention the fact that the evacuation of Jaffa was also part of my work. And I remember reading about Gaza, which in fact I also use as an argument to say, see, it happened in Jaffa, but actually it happened before in Gaza. But as you mentioned, I too, I must admit that I didn't follow up. I just read these documents and I skipped the fact that there had been an evacuation before. Certainly the evacuation of Jaffa would deserve, I guess, its own podcast, because it's such a fascinating event. And also to discuss how it was portrayed at the time, and then how it had been picked up later on, particularly by, I would say, traditional Zionist historiography. And now when you look at the documents, you can actually, trace a different kind of history of that particular historical event. But I want to go back to Gaza. Now, Gaza today is defined, and I would say rightly so, the largest open-air prison in the world, given the fact that it's surrounded by Israeli walls, fences, and troops, and is obviously also the waterways are essentially blocked, and people are confined within the borders of the Gaza Strip itself. But back then, during the Ottoman times, Gaza was a different kind of city. And I was wondering if you can give us a sense of Gaza, particularly under the Ottomans, because I think that today we are stuck with these images of Gaza today, and we forget that there was a different kind of city, where people lived obviously in a very different way than from today.
Yes, indeed. Today's reality in the Gaza Strip, arguably the most securitized enclave in an open air prison in the world. That was my kind of second trajectory to start digging into Gaza's past. I grew up in Israel into a period where Gaza started to be disconnected from Israel and the world. So this is a process that started rolling from the first Intifada through Oslo, with an important benchmark in the Israeli disengagement from Gaza, and then the rise of Hamas to power, and the Israeli blockade on the Gaza Strip, and the routine wars since then. So I grew up with the sense of this place being in another world. And indeed, when I started looking into the history, I discovered a totally different place that is maybe the complete opposite. It is well connected to its surroundings. It's maritime, desert, and agricultural surrounding, with a very firm connections between the city and its hinterland, between the city and trading ships traveling in the Mediterranean, and with nomad tribal confederacies roaming Sinai Desert into the southern Palestine desert, into Arabia. And this belongingness of Gaza to its wider region, and the city's connectivity during the late Ottoman period was something that was totally the mirror picture of what I've experienced from the Gaza Strip of today, as this place remote from the eye, from the mind, which is only, at least for me as a young Israeli growing up in 1990s Israel, was a place that can be only reached through media, categorized in a very specific way. And this fascinated me, both the question of what was there before the Gaza Strip, but also, and I think not less importantly, the question of how the development of this region, of the Gaza region, during the late Ottoman period into the Mandate period, enabled or created the terms for the later creation of the Gaza Strip. So if we're talking specifically about late Ottoman Gaza, we're talking about a city that is roughly from the 1840s, from the Ottoman reconquest of Palestine, is starting to go through a gradual change from a city that served mostly the paths moving through the desert, either going from Egypt through the Middle Passage of Sinai to the city of Aqaba, and roads that are traveling in Transjordan, and Gaza is located right at the middle to facilitate both of these roads. Gaza is starting to go through a change, which it directs its attention more and more to the sea and to maritime trade, and start to leave those ground roads and the connection of these tribal confederacies around Gaza to this routes running from Syria and from Egypt. Into the second half of the 19th century, the increasing activity of maritime trade in the Mediterranean would tie the city of Gaza to its hinterland, and tribes around Gaza would turn more and more under Ottoman pressure to be agriculturalists, supplying Gaza with the cash crop, mostly grains, and even particularly barley. And Gaza would start as a city, and the merchant community of Gaza would start trading in these grains, and mostly in barley, with Europe. So by and large, what we're seeing during the late Ottoman period is a city that is, if I use the phrasing of Johan Busso in his book Hamidian Palestine, a city that is moving from being a port on the shores of the desert to being a port on the shores of the sea. So this is kind of the broad process, looking from a bird's eye view.
Would you say Gaza was a cosmopolitan city, similar to Jaffa and Jerusalem, or was still much more homogeneous in terms of population?
We usually think of Gaza as more homogeneous, but the comparison to Jaffa and Jerusalem, I think, should be taken with a pinch of salt, because when Gaza starts its journey of change, let's say from the mid-19th century, Jaffa is also a very small city and not as cosmopolitan as we want to imagine it, or as it would develop to be soon enough. And also Jerusalem has not yet experienced the onslaught of European missionaries and so on. I mean, from the 1840s onwards, but not before. But the character of Gaza may be, I wouldn't say contrary to other cities, but what makes Gaza unique in this sense, is this very close ties with populations which comes from different climatic environments or terrains. So you would find in Gaza in the 19th century, you'd find important presence and political centrality of tribal sheikhs, for instance. And you would find ties, very close ties and important ties between the elite families of Gaza and tribal leaders. And you would also find something of an Egyptian element in Gaza. I'm not sure it is as pronounced as some of the literature claim it to be, but nonetheless, Gaza was the entrance point into Egypt for anyone coming from the south, and the entry point to Greater Syria from the north, and the entry point to anyone coming to Greater Syria from the south. And there were families of and merchants of Egyptian origin, and you can find it in festivals celebrated in Gaza, also in the Gazan dialect, and other cultural traits. The process of coastal cities like Jaffa, and obviously the most telling example is Beirut, the turning of these cities to have a kind of cosmopolitan character happened at the same time that Gaza is losing its centrality as an important city in the path between the agricultural land, the settled land, and the desert. Because while we're describing Gaza as a city that acquires more and more a role as a port city or a coastal city, this in fact was not, when we look at this process from its results, this in fact was not a, we cannot say positive in history, but this was not something that developed Gaza into being a actual bustling cosmopolitan port city, but it established Gaza as a kind of a maritime station that steamships that would move on the path from Alexandria to Beirut and would dock in small ports on the way, or move through Jaffa and through other places. They would travel through Gaza, but they would never dock indeed on the Gazan coast, but far away, far off in like 2 miles into the water, because Gaza's seashore is shallow and there is a continental shelf going deep into the water, so steamships cannot actually approach the coast. And at the same time, Gaza was central within its environmental context of connecting Sinai, Greater Syria, and Arabia. And once it moves to be used only as this maritime gate, it in effect loses much of its raison d'etre of being located where it is on the edge of the desert. So most of these tribes are no longer roaming these wide areas, but they are getting closer and closer into Gaza and also to Beersheba. And Gaza becomes much more limited in its economic abilities and in its political influence in the region. So we have this process whereby Gaza is integrating into this system of maritime cities. But while other cities would become more cosmopolitan, more international, Gaza would actually go through this process of localization, would be much more connected to its very immediate hinterland, rather than to the larger region, ranging from Greater Syria to Hijaz and to Sinai.
I was wondering about the population. While Gaza might not have been so cosmopolitan as other places, but I was wondering to what extent non-Muslim communities, in fact, were living in Gaza city. So, about Jews and Christians, and perhaps even Europeans.
So there is an historic Christian community, Orthodox community in Gaza. They were always a minority, nevertheless, quite a protected minority. Church Missionary Society established a foothold in Gaza. If I'm not mistaken, their first appearance was in the late 1870s. But then Gaza became one of the main centers of the Anglican Church Missionary Society in Palestine. In fact, the society established a very significant hospital in Gaza. Nevertheless, their proselytization efforts were not very successful. In terms of Jews, so this is an interesting story. Whoever deals with the history of Jewish diaspora before modernity would say that there was always something of a Jewish presence in Gaza. But in the 19th century, it seems that if there was anything, it was very minor. But what you see is a renewed Jewish community starting to settle in Gaza in the 1880s. So roughly in parallel to the arrival of Zionist Jews to other places, actually there was a small group that affiliated with the Bilu immigrants that arrived in Gaza, but they left Gaza very fast. But the community that establishes itself there is a community of Maghrebi Jews, mostly came from Jerusalem, within the context of looking for new financial options in other places. So as part of the defortification of Jerusalem and the plight of communities outside of the walls, some saw the opportunities of taking part in the maritime trade that was developing in Gaza, saw this as a promising opportunity. And from the 1880s, we would find the Sephardi community in Gaza. And this community was there until the First World War, reaching to the amount of some 200 people, I guess, when it was the biggest. Arabic-speaking community that had very good relations with the Muslim majority, and some ambivalent connections or relations with Zionist institutions. In fact, this community of Sephardi Jews was trading with the Zionists in information about land purchase, and also in mediation to local Arab landlords. In return, they got financial support, and also some religious services like a shochet, a ritual slaughterer, and the rabbi. And the Zionists did serious efforts to Zionize them, to draw them into Zionism, but these were not very successful. In fact, most of the Zionist teachers that were sent to Gaza in order to educate the youth of this community mostly ran away in a few months. Within a few months, because of the bad experience that they had there, and the community in fact vanished when World War I started. Mostly immigrated to Alexandria, and the very last were evacuated with the rest of the city in March 1917. After the war, there was a small Zionist community settled in Gaza, and started to establish itself and attract more settlers to move into Gaza. But at the time, Gaza was ruined because of the war. We can talk about it later. And many settlers wanted to join, and Zionist institutions, the Zionist executive was not very keen to invest in the far-fetched city of mostly Arab Muslim population, and this community was struggling for around 2 decades, and in 1929 it ran away from Gaza in its entirety, and this community was never reestablished.
I was wondering about the position of Gaza, not geographically speaking, obviously, in late Ottoman Palestine in terms of political relations, administration. How did the Ottomans placed Gaza in basically in the map of Palestine? And also, given the fact that you wrote an article about a consular agent, Alexander Knesevich, probably I'm going to butcher the pronunciation here, before World War I, which was published on Jerusalem Quarterly number 81. I was wondering also if you can tell us something about these kind of diplomatic relations that developed in the city of Gaza?
Yes, of course. In terms of locating Gaza on the map, so under the Ottomans, Gaza was a sub-district capital within the independent Sanjak or Mutasarrif of Jerusalem. So there was a Kaimakam set in Gaza and was subordinate to the Mutasarrif of Jerusalem. But that was, Gaza was a sub-district until the First World War, when Ottoman military administration took over. But the fact that it had the same title throughout this period does not mean that it was equally central, politically central throughout the period, because as the Ottomans are establishing their sovereignty deeper and deeper into southern Palestine, into the desert and the tribal territories, they would establish substitutes for Gaza, and the most important one is, of course, Beersheba. And Beersheba is established alongside a new sub-district that is called the sub-district of Beersheba, initially in 1889, and then in 1900, the city itself is being established as the sub-district capital. And what the Ottomans would do is to take the territory that once belonged to Gaza and path it to the Beersheba Kaimakam, and the Gaza sub-district would actually diminish in size, and the Gaza Kaimakam would no longer be the one responsible for tribal affairs. While this is being done politically and administratively, this does not mean that the tribes are officially disconnected from Gaza. On the contrary, in fact, when Beersheba is established, basically this would epitomize the long-standing process of settling the tribes, making them sedentary. And Beersheba being established as a center for settled tribes, that means that these tribes would also move from pastoral economy to rely mostly on agriculture. And when relying on agriculture, it means that they produce cash crops, and cash crops are being sold in the Gaza market. So while administratively the Ottomans are playing with who's responsible for what territory and to what type of population, economically or financially, the tribes are still connected and getting more and more attached to the city of Gaza as the gate outwards in terms of finance. Regarding Knesevich, Anton Alexander Knesevich, so he's really a fascinating figure, a son of an Austrian family. His father was brought to the Ottoman Empire as a doctor to serve on a medical mission, maybe as part of the Ottoman 1840s quarantine system to Tripoli, to Tripoli Sham, to Tripoli in today's Lebanon, and was married there to a woman named Jdaisel. Her name was, if I'm not mistaken, Jdaizalzad, but maybe I am. So don't catch me on this. The Knesevich father, his name is Andrei Knesevich. Anton was probably born in Tripoli, but then the city moved to Gaza. Again, they might have moved to Gaza as well as part of the father's service on the quarantine system, because in the 1850s, the Ottomans established 2 quarantines in southern Palestine, on the southern edge of Palestine, which means in Gaza and in Hebron. the two southernmost cities before you move into the desert, one on the mountain and the other on the plains, Gaza and Hebron, which are a twin cities of sort. And from early age, Anton Ignazovic worked for the CMS, for the Church Missionary Society. He worked at that dispensary. And later on, he worked as an agent of Lloyd's, of the shipping insurance company, and being well acquainted with the shipping system and the trade system of Gaza, is being offered to the British consul in Jerusalem to serve as a consular agent when British interests in the barley trade in Gaza got stronger and stronger. So after a few years of back and forth, he was finally nominated as a British consular agent in 1906, right on time to facilitate the British with intelligence when the 1906 Aqaba crisis broke out. And indeed, without getting too much into the details of the Aqaba crisis, that was a kind of a preliminary event to World War I. The British and the Ottomans are clashing around the interests on the shores of the Red Sea, right at the passage between Sinai and Arabia. And Knesevich, sitting in the city which is the closest to this region, and can spot the Ottoman army arranging and gathering in the vicinity of Gaza. So he's vital for the British for British intelligence, and indeed he supplies a lot of it. And he would serve at the same purpose later on in the Tripoli War in 1911, when Italy invades what is today Libya, and the Ottoman army would try to assist its forces on the shores of Libya. And to do so, he would have to travel from Syria through Palestine and then move through Sinai. There was a lot of problems there because the British declared Egypt as a neutral territory, so the British blocked the 1906 border, but Knesevich was there on the border in order to report and give intelligence about what's going on with the Ottomans. So he was very useful for the British, and at the same time, he did all sorts of things that got the British very mad, and not only the British. For instance, mediating and brokering lands for Zionist settlers, sometimes on Sinai land, which was, of course, under British authority, what almost caused the British to throw him away. Eventually, the Ottomans, when World War I starts, being on this liminal position of being an Austrian national, so that means an ally of the Ottomans, but at the same time a British consular agents. The Ottomans don't know exactly what to do with him, and they send him to Damascus, and he spends part of the war there. But then, obviously, with the establishment of the British Mandate, his role as a consular agent is no longer needed. This is the story of Alexander Knesevich. He's a very colorful figure.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
It sounds very colorful, and it reminds me that when the Ottomans didn't like someone, they sent them to Damascus in the best case scenario, like they did with many others, like Nissim Malul, Albert Antebi, and the patriarch of a Catholic and Latin church, and so forth. So I guess at some point in Damascus, there must have been a circle of exiled, perhaps a topic to write about another day. But it's fascinating because obviously Damascus really became the center of all of these exiled people from Palestine. And I guess one wonders whether they had a chance to meet or they were under control by Ottoman authorities. Obviously, here we are talking about World War I and the role of Gaza in the conflict. So as a border city, essentially, between British-controlled Egypt and the Ottoman forces. So what happened to Gaza during the war?
If we've drawn the process by which Gaza is becoming a kind of a economic periphery to the world market, but also within Palestine. So what happens at the same time is that the Gaza borderland, again, this malleable region that connects Greater Syria and Sinai and Hijaz, which Gaza was a part of, together with Aqaba, together with Suez. So this entire borderland is being torn apart because the routes that were taking north to south and west to east are no longer relevant because of maritime trade. The tribes are being settled and they now do agriculture. And within these conditions, and as the British are taking over Egypt and the Ottomans are moving farther and farther into southern Palestine, both are clashing in this contact zone and basically dividing these borderland between them in 1906. So this is the border between the Ottoman Empire and British-ruled Egypt. And exactly on this border, earlier I said preliminary event to World War I, because this border would be the place where the two powers would clash once again in 1917. So obviously it starts with the Ottoman attack on the Suez Canal, but then the Ottomans would, led by Qas von Kessenstein and Jamal Pasha, but then the Ottomans would withdrew for the rest of 1915 and 1916, and eventually the line of defense that the Ottomans would establish basically for the entire Greater Syria would be the line between Gaza and Beersheba, the exact line where you move from the desert into the settled land. The British would arrive to this line around January 1917, and the city that is basically where the Ottoman army was arranging was the city of Gaza, again since 1906. That would be the linchpin to Egypt, but also the last point where the Ottomans would try to prevent the British from passing. The British attacked Gaza 3 times. The first battle was in March, and the second was in April 1917. Within this context, Jamal Pasha decided the evacuation of the city of Gaza before the first battle in March. But in these 2 events, the Ottomans prevailed. The Ottoman defenders prevailed, and they did not let the British pass. But then both armies would move into trench war from the worst kind, from the kind that we know of in the Western Front, and basically would let artillery do the job. And these are long months that the British howitzers would bombard Gaza, where the Ottoman army had entrenched itself. And within between bombardments and the Ottoman efforts for fortification, the city is basically being destroyed. I mean, the very physical infrastructure, the houses themselves, the streets, are being toppled and destroyed and disassembled for the Ottoman fortification. And the concluding battle in the end of October 1917, when the British would make their famous detour through Beersheba, and then and would break the line, the Ottoman defense line in Beersheba, and then would just move to just to mark a V on Gaza. Basically, this entire maneuver left Gaza totally destroyed. The people of Gaza, let me just remind, are in exile. They found shelter in different places, going as far as Aleppo, but most of them in Jaffa, in Jerusalem, in northern Palestine, in the villages around, and they would start little by little to go back to their city and find it in total ruins. And in fact, most of the people of the pre-war period would just decide not to go back. So if before the war we had around 40,000 people in Gaza, in the first British census in 1922, there were only 17,000 people, so less than a half. And this number persists also until the census of 1931. So it is only in the latter half of the 1930s that the city would start gaining back its original population, and it would be around the end of the Mandate period that the city would go back to numbers which are above 40,000 people in terms of within the urban sphere of Gaza. So the effect of wartime destruction was crucial for the development of Gaza in the post-war years. And partially, if we try to understand where was Gaza during the crucial period of the development of Palestinian national, the making of Palestinian national identity, or the development of Palestinian national awareness, where was it during the development of the Zionist Palestinian conflict in the Mandate period, where Gaza wasn't really there. It wasn't really there because it was still recovering from World War I. And in this sense, World War I had turned out to be much longer in Gaza than in other places, not only in Palestine, but in the Middle East more generally.
This reminds me, the studies done particularly on the European front by scholars obviously like Jay Winter, who argue that the war doesn't end in 1918, but in many locations and for many people ends even a decade later, or it might even ended up after World War II because of the kind of the long-term consequences of the war. And this also reminded me of the population of Jaffa, on the other hand, returned rather quickly to their homes after the British took over. But it's also true that the city was not heavily bombarded or destroyed in the same way as Gaza, which was effectively a front city, very similar to other European towns that found themselves essentially close to the trenches. And so they suffered a kind of destruction. Before I ask you the question about interwar Gaza, I want to ask you about sources. How one does write the history of Gaza, particularly in the late Ottoman era and the early 20th century? Where are the sources? What is the material available? And what are the issues of accessibility to that material?
So obviously, being an Israeli writing about Gaza, the question of accessibility of sources was on my mind from the first step. And a sort of methodological decision that I had to make in a very early stage was that I would not be able to supply a sort of eyewitness account or something that relates to my own experience of how the urban space and the society is projecting is the history of this place is being projected upon the contemporary society. And in this regard, I treat Gaza the same way that people would maybe treat archaeological sites. I mean, this is not something that you can actually recover, but you would have to use very much your imagination. As far as I know, there weren't research that had been done on Gaza in recent years hasn't used a specific archive that is held today in Gaza that I miss or that I don't have access to. Obviously, if I could visit local collections, documents held in households in Gaza, obviously I would benefit a lot. But in terms of official collections or archives, I think there's nothing that I think that scholars of my generation have utilized that is prevented from me. So what So the places where I did went to find were mostly the Ottoman archive. The Ottoman archive supplies a lot of information about the administrative and financial arrangements within the city. The British archives and various Israeli archives, including the Israeli State Archive, which holds most of the materials from the British Mandate, and alongside chronicles and memoirs, and a very important source, which is a kind of encyclopedia of Gaza, a kind of a combination of a gazetteer and a biographical dictionary and the history book and whatever you like, that of 4 volumes. It's called Ithaf el-Aiza fi Tarikh Gaza. Presenting the notables with the history of Gaza or something of this sort by Sheikh Othman Mustafa Attaba, which is this compilation from the completed in the 1940s, but it acts as a primary source for all means and purposes. I also used some Waqf registers and court records, especially where I tried to reconstruct the landscape of ruins within Gaza, because a lot of wartime ruins also had connections to the same buildings as Waqf assets or as things that are being bought and sold within court records. So these were mostly my let's say ordinary sources, and for reconstructing what's going on in the war, I used a lot of photographs and also paintings that are giving some idea of how the city looked like, or maybe more precisely how people wanted it to look or to represent it.
I guess we need to wait for the opening of the Ottoman records related to the Fourth Army and Jamal Pasha, records that are held in Istanbul, and no one knows when they will be available, to reconstruct the wartime period, and also better times to perhaps find personal records, essentially to get the Wasif Juwaria and Isan Turjman that told us so much about wartime Jerusalem, but also, someone similar that will tell us about Gaza in the period of World War I.
Yeah, that would be a treasure. But for the Ottoman army record, we would have to wait long. I'm not sure that in our academic lifetime.
I must concur that probably it's not going to be even our relatively young generation, but it will be another one.
Yeah.
I have one more question about Gaza, and this is absolutely the follow-up. What happened during the interwar periods? How did Gaza sort of redevelop? And you already mentioned the trauma of the war, the fact that obviously there's so much destruction that it took decades, in fact, to bring back people. But how did the British approach the city of Gaza? Did they invest money, or was it left to basically its own devices?
So it's both answers are correct. The British had a plan. No, they didn't invest money, but they invest effort. They had a plan. At the same time, they left it for its own devices. Basically, the first to approach the misery of Gaza after World War I was the first High Commissioner Herbert Samuel, who, together with several of the city notables and the British officials, conceived a plan, a reconstruction plan, which was very detailed. Basically, what the British wanted to do is to take the part of land which which separated Gaza from the seashore. That was a few kilometers of sand dunes, and take this area, which was state-owned land under the category of mahlul, and parcelize it and sell it in an auction. And from the money gained, they wanted to establish an account that would give loans to people who want to reconstruct their houses within the destroyed city. So a very convoluted way of basically making, sort of kicking off Gaza's recovery with its own devices. So you take this state land and then you give it, you sell it to people in order to start engineering something of the construction on the sand dunes. But at the same time, you take this money and you give it out as a loan for people who their houses were destroyed, and then you try to recover the city while establishing the new part or kind of a coastal suburb of Gaza closer to the seashore. Obviously, as you may hear, that was too complex of a plan to be materialized, and it mostly failed, and it until the mid 1930s, it remained only on the paper. But what it did do, it prevented other reconstruction mechanisms from emerging, because there was always this horizon that the British are about to do something, and they already have plans about what to do with the sandy lands, for instance. So while they are doing this, nothing else can happen. And since they are always in the process of constructing this account for loans, so people don't want to invest their own money because they know they can get cheaper money by the government. So until the 1930s, you would find that with this expectation to what the British are basically planning but never comes to life, the city still remains stuck in its own in its post-war situation. And as we said earlier, many of the population is basically looking at all these developments from afar, from Jaffa, from other places. So until the 1930s, this vision of a new city on the sand, combined with other projects that the British has, for instance, of arresting the sand dunes from drifting by planting forests. That was not only a project in Gaza, but Gaza was far away enough in order for the British to take Gaza as an experiment for what happens when you plant trees, species coming from Australia, in the coasts of Palestine. And this project would intervene within the project of building this coastal suburb. So everything in the region of Gaza is stuck within British bureaucracy in terms of creating a new city. And at the same time, there is a very heavy involvement within the old city of Gaza, the destroyed city, of the British Antiquities Department. This is something that you and I share interest in all these conservation projects. So Jerusalem is one case being sacred and mysterious and ancient. Gaza has another specificity for drawing conservationists, the fact of it being ruined. And ruins is always something that ignite the imagination of archaeologists and conservationist architects. And when the people at the Department of Antiquities sees Gaza, they say, okay, so this is the best test case for what we can do with preservation. It's all in ruins now, so we can just freeze everything, decide what we want to preserve and how. We can also expose all the ancient layers of these buildings because everything is in ruin, everything is neglected and abandoned. So the historic buildings of Gaza, mostly the ones that are related or at least interpreted as relating to the Mamluk period, they are all being targeted by the British Department of Antiquities to be preserved. So in part of the urban sphere within Gaza is being frozen by the Department of Antiquities, so the locals would not be able to recover it the way they want and to make it useful again, because it is all contingent upon what the Department of Antiquity would want to make Gaza of, or how they want to create Gaza as this in this neo Mamluk style. So pretty much what the committee does in Cairo, but only a few decades back, would happen in small scale within the old city of Gaza itself, which also would interfere within the spontaneous and the more natural way that people would try to recover their own destroyed assets. So it would only be post the Great Palestinian Revolt and towards the Second World War that the British would loosen their grip a little bit from these lavish plans and would let the area of Gaza to kind of gain momentum with independent recovery. And this would also, of course, would receive a serious boost with the money that enters the region with the Second World War.
This was Dotan Halevy, who took us to the first trip outside Jerusalem. Dotan is currently a postdoctoral research at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem and has published a large number of articles dedicated to late-Ottoman Gaza and the interwar Gaza. And hopefully we will read soon a book dedicated to the history of Gaza in this period of time. Having said that, Dotan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.